in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. Today, my guest is Dr. Valter Longo. Now, Dr. Longo is the Edna M. Jones Professor of Gerontology and Biological Sciences and Director of the Longevity Institute at the University of Southern California, here over where I'm at, and one of the leading centers for research on aging and age-related disease. He is also director of the Longevity and Cancer Program at the IFOM Institute of Molecular Oncology in Milan, Italy, and he's the author of The Longevity Diet, Slow Aging, Fight Disease, Optimize Weight. Welcome, Dr. Longo.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I have actually been very interested in your work for some time, and one of the things that I find fascinating is that you have been involved in everything from basic science to translational and clinical. So it gives you sort of a unique perspective that a lot of people in this space don't have. The first thing I think it might be helpful for us to do is just to cover some of the basics of fasting. So if you don't mind, you know, we're going to talk a lot about fasting, and if you could, maybe just define the different kinds of fasting that people do, and perhaps in that summary, you might include the role of this fasting mimetic diet that you've developed.
Yeah, so the major types of fasting, one of them is called time-restricted eating, and some people refer to it as intermittent fasting, and involves basically not eating for anywhere from 12 to 22 hours per day. Now there's a lot of people that do 16 hours of fasting, and we can talk about it, and skip breakfast. But a lot of data suggests that comes with benefits, but also problems. Whereas the 12 hours of fasting per day, maybe 13 hours, very little negatives, a lot of positives associated with these daily fasting routines. The other one is something called alternate day fasting. I don't want to talk too much about it because it's just eating every other day.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. It would be very difficult for the great majority of people to do that. And the other one close to it is the 5-2, so fasting for 2 days a week. I also think that's extremely difficult for the great majority of people to do something like that. So I don't talk about those two very much. And I talk about the time-restricted eating, and then I talk about the fasting mimicking diet. And the idea of the fasting mimicking diet that comes out of my lab is that you don't need to do this all the time. It can be done on a need to do a basis. And some people, like say a diabetic person, we finish a number of trials on it. They need to do it once a month for at least for the first year. But some people, somebody is 25 and very physically very active and in great shape, they may only do it maybe twice a year if their BMI is already 20.
I want to get into that diet more specifically in a moment, but I think a good leeway from there would be to get a perspective on, you know, what's exactly kind of happening at the cellular level to the extent that we know. Why is fasting good for us? I know maybe you could talk about some of the concepts of autophagy and, you know, and I don't know how much of the role of mTOR that you believe, you know, is involved here, but if you could give us some background.
Yes. So I always say fasting doesn't mean anything. There is no mechanism of fasting because you can fast for 2 hours, you can fast for 2 months. So it's a very completely different world. After 2 hours, nothing happens. After 2 months, everything happens, and you're probably going to be near death.
Right.
So then I think that if you start looking at, so let's say, cellular reprogramming, stem cell activation, autophagy, then you got to get into the 4 or 5 day range minimum, right? So to get a lot of these effects. And why is that? Well, something very simple is if you look at our clinical trials, at the end of the 5 day fasting mimicking diet, you start seeing people not shrunk that much, but shrunk a little bit, meaning that the white blood cell starts becoming lower, not that much lower, but a little bit lower, the muscle. So in general, the person becomes a little bit smaller, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that little bit smaller becomes a lot smaller if you go much longer. Let's say somebody did a month of fasting, mimicking diet or fasting. And so, of course, then once you shrink, you are basically hoping that at some point the food comes back around, and then you have an opportunity to re-expand, right? So you shrink and re-expand. And that process seems to involve very sophisticated mechanisms, of which autophagy is just a small part, right? And it's a true breakdown and rebuilding program, which involves stem cells, reprogramming, and breakdown, repair, and lots of different things. Yeah. So that's generally what happens after, let's say, about 5 days of fasting. Now people can say, well, why don't you go longer? Can you get better effects? And I just told you, if you go shorter, you don't get a lot of these effects.
Right.
If you go longer, you could get more effects on one side, but you can also start getting problems. Not only the safety, the hypotension, the hypoglycemia, et cetera, but also the hypometabolism, for example. So the human body eventually slows down. And why does it slow down when you fast for too long? Because there is a protective mechanism against starvation. If you use too much energy, you might run out of fat that you stored away, and you're gonna die, right? So then historically, the human body has developed this ability to slow down and get into a semi-hibernation mode, and then it potentially maybe even getting close to hibernation mode if needed. Yeah.
Look, just for some clarity here, when you talk about the 4 or 5 days needed, when you're talking about time-restricted feeding in particular, with a, say, 8-hour window, or I think you mentioned 12-hour window might be better, are you still referring to that as only a 4 to 5 day intervention as well? Or are you talking about specifically, the more significant type fasting or the fasting mimetic diet? I'm just curious on that, because so many people, including me, are doing sort of a long-term time-restricted feeding schedule.
It's completely different. The time-restricted eating is what you do every day, right? So, for example, every day I do 12 hours, maybe 13 hours sometimes of fasting, and then I do 11 to 12 hours of feeding. And so that's what you do every day, all year round. The more you maintain it like that, and you don't go back and forth, let's say on the weekend, the better it is, right? The body likes to have this clock, this circadian rhythm, and stick with it. And so good to pick one and stay with it. Now, if you violate by 1 hour or less than 1 hour more, that's okay. I mean, you don't need to continuously worry about, I finished dinner at 8, I must eat at 8 a.m., right? So it's okay. Then the fasting mimicking diet is a very different thing, right? And fasting mimicking diet is a true opportunity to reset the system periodically, right? And it doesn't have to be done at any given time, and it doesn't have to be done frequently. It just needs to be done when you need to do it. And until we know more, right? So we just published 2 clinical papers, or 1 clinical paper with 2 clinical trials, showing 2.5 years of biological age reduction in people that did the fasting mimicking diet 3 times, once a month. And then, so we measure a baseline, and then.
And again, just for clarity, that was 3 times, meaning like they did it for, I believe the diet protocol is 4 days, correct?
5 days.
5 days. So they did it 5 days per month, essentially, for 3 months. And they saw 2.5 year reduction in epigenetic age.
Non-epigenetic, we use the BioAge clock, generated by Levine, and that's based on blood markers, and lots of blood markers. So that's 2.5 years on average biological age reduction. So the point being that eventually it may turn out that we show that if you did it once a month, you can gain much more of an effect eventually, and we'll recommend that. But I think right now that 3 times a year is probably a good place to start for most people, right? And so we're hoping now we finish trials on diabetes, showing diabetes regression and also reversal. Now that we've done trials on cancer, showing overall survival improvements, etc., I think it's fairly reasonable to say to doctors and people, okay, maybe doctors should have this in the toolkit. It shouldn't only be about GLP-1 agonist. It should also be about ways to get people healthy again and younger. You're not going to make them young again, but younger, right? So 2.5 years, it's good, and so I think people should consider the fasting mimicking diet a few times a year.
So, can you talk a little bit, maybe go into a little bit more depth on maybe the physiology that occurs during the fasting mimetic diet, or fasting in general during these 4 days that is different, say, from your ongoing time restricted feeding? What's different about it that at the physiological or molecular level that, I mean, I know you don't want to go into too much detail, but if you could kind of give us a sense for some of that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not what's different about it. They're two completely different things, right? So, after 12 hours, you have glycogen reserves,
right,
that are covering your glucose needs, basically, right? And as you get to about 2 to 3 days, that's when the ketogenesis, the ketone bodies, the fat, mostly abdominal fat, but not only abdominal, there's breakdown, and now the body starts utilizing fatty acids and ketone bodies coming from those fats as fuel in the heart, in the brain, in lots of different organs. And the body also starts making glucose through gluconeogenesis, using glycerol, amino acids, etc., for the brain, but not only the brain. So that basically you're making glucose and you're breaking down fats, and without taking, because of course you're not taking any glucose from the outside, any sugars from the outside. So yeah, the longer that fasting is, the more then the body starts turning into a full response. And the full response now is not just breaking down fat, which happens within a couple of days, but it's also start looking around for what don't I need right now? Can I break it down? And then next becomes, what can I start eating that belongs to me? And so you want to consume less fuel, and at the same time you want to use yourself as fuel, right?
Yeah.
So this doesn't happen for 2 to 3 days, right? So then what happens what's the difference? Well, it's a completely different world, right? The world doesn't even begin until 2 to 3 days into the fasting mimicking diet, and much less the world of stem cell activation, the world of Yamanaka factor activation, cellular reprogramming. That begins probably around day 4, autophagy, around day 4 or 5. We just finished a trial, or I just saw the results of a trial, and day 4, the autophagy was still very little, but the end of the FMD, now you're starting to see autophagy be very high. So even 4 days of fasting, and Guido Kromer had published something very similar in his human study, even after 4 days of fasting, the autophagy is minimal.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I think just to summarize, because I think so many people are doing time restricted feeding right now, thinking that that we're doing a lot of the things that you're talking about that really only occur after multiple days of the fasting mimetic diet. So as a framework, it's interesting to think about it as sort of, one is more lifestyle and I guess just trying to keep your body in physiologic order and in line with circadian rhythms, which would be time restricted feeding. And then the mimetic diet, the fasting mimetic diet, would be more intervention. So almost like a drug in some ways, because obviously you're using it here in cancer patients. You're using it, I believe there's some data on multiple sclerosis as well. that, and then when in those kinds of things, I'm curious in particular, with cancer patients, is it primarily just so for the audience to know, there's an effect called the Warburg effect, basically, which is, these cancer cells have preferential, interest in glucose. Is this an anti-Warburg effect type thing that's causing the benefit in cancer patients, or is there? I'm sure the mechanism is probably a lot more sophisticated than that, but I'm curious what that is.
Yeah. I mean, this idea, Warburg got this Nobel Prize for some of this work in about 100 years ago, in I think 1931. Of course, almost none of this is used in the clinic.
Right.
That cancer cells. I always say we never cure the mouse with the fasting, right? No matter what
Right.
you do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we cure the mouse with fasting and chemo. We cured mice with fasting and kinase inhibitor, with fasting and hormone therapy. So then there is an anti-Warburg effect in lots of different cancers when you do fasting and fasting mimicking diets. But the key to cure the cancer or really affect the progression of the cancer is to target what we call starvation escape pathways. So we published a few years ago the actual method to do it very quickly, and now we're moving into clinical trials. So you starve the patient, you give the patient the fasting mimicking diet, and then the cancers, the normal cells know what to do, and they go into a standby mode. They slow down their metabolism. They may slow down cell growth, but the cancer cells, to some degree, they rebel, and to rebel, of course, the sugar is lower, the IGF-1 is lower, the insulin may be lower, lots of amino acids. Some of them are higher, some of them are lower, but it's just a revolutionized environment. So the cancer cell now has to find a way to stay alive, right? And so we exploit this identification by RNA sequencing of the escape pathways. So once we find out what the escape pathway is, then we can target it with lots of drugs. And it's been very in our hands. And so now a number of trials are showing that. I mean, the trials, of course, started with less sophisticated intervention like chemo plus FMD. And in women, last year, the Vernieri group showed that triple negative breast cancer at 4 years overall survival, the survival was 15.6% in chemo alone versus 35.7 or so in chemo plus FMD cycles, right? So big difference, at least in that initial study for triple negative breast cancer. But so then I think that once we get to the next level, which is very soon, right? The next 12 months, this is going to work a lot better.
I would imagine you probably had quite a bit pushback from the physicians you were working with cancer patients, because, when I think about chemotherapy, as, I think I haven't dealt with cancer patients since medical school, so we're talking about, 20 years plus. But I mean, one of the ideas was you wanted to have adequate nutrition. So the idea of fasting was sort of counterintuitive for patients on chemotherapy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, at the beginning, so the beginning was a long time ago, right? So it was like 15, 20 years ago. Right. When we approached clinicians, I mean, it wasn't the easiest task, and people thought it was a little bit of a crazy idea. But then I think, even within a few years, our colleagues here, David Quinn, Tanya Dorf, and a lot of our oncologists, they pretty quickly got on it, and said, okay, let's test it. We don't know what's going to happen. Let's just test it. And we've seen this all over the world. The research hospitals, the Mayo Clinic, and MD Anderson, and lots of top hospitals have always been very interested. Some of them have joined the trials. Some of them have shown interest in joining the trials. But I think from the research universities from all over the world, we got very little resistance in the sense of doing trials. But of course, still resistance in, or should we apply this to patients? I think that most oncologists will say, as long as you do the standard of care and maybe stay away from the early stage cancer patients. But for those that are not responding, for whom there is not a viable solution, I think that most oncologists, even the ones that are not in top research centers, have said, yes, I'll allow this, right? So if somebody stage 4 triple negative breast cancer, and you're going to have a 15% 4-year survival, I think that most oncologists, okay, if you want to try that, even though you're not in a clinical trial, if you want to try the fasting mimicking diet, I'll allow it as long as you take the standard of care.
Can you describe the fasting mimicking diet itself? Obviously, I think one of the things that I'm guessing probably helped was that you weren't just telling them to diet; you were giving them food. So it's a different kind of, it's almost more of a giving somebody a pill or a box of food or something like that probably helped that situation. What's in it? I mean, and maybe from a caloric standpoint, from a macronutrient standpoint.
Yeah, so we tried to, at the beginning, when I wrote my book, the first book, at least in the Italian version of it before the US version, I talked about recipes in the sense of how to make a fasting mimicking diet and all of that. And there was a mistake, right? It was a mistake because I think a lot of people went home and they did not talk to the doctor, did not talk to the nutritionist, just went home and cooked it up, Yeah. And as you can imagine, now that becomes a disaster situation because people combine it with cancer on their own, with cardiovascular disease, and
Right.
with autoimmunities, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so then now we're basically saying I'm helping any hospital and every clinic in the world, not just hospitals. Some of them are not even hospitals, university hospitals, they're just clinics, to do a trial with the fasting mimicking diet. It comes in a box, and there's a version for autoimmunities, there's a version for Alzheimer's, there's a version for cancer, there's a very, very different, by the way. And so we allow independent universities and centers to test it. And I help them as a professor, not as an entrepreneur. But then there is a company that I founded in 2009 that I don't take consulting from them. I made that decision because I didn't want the conflict,
Sure.
and I don't. I will assign 100% of the shares to charity, and I already started in that process. But I think it's important. I think it's important to standardize it, put it in a box,
Yeah.
and make it always the same. If it works for cancer patient, then every oncologist in the world is going to say, like a medicine, I'm going to order that. It's called Xantigen for cancer.
Yeah.
I'm going to order that box for cancer patient and use it together, let's say, with immunotherapy. Now there's 3 or 4 trials starting right now, FMD plus immunotherapy. And so it works, it doesn't work, we'll see. But if it works, now you have a standardized version of it that every patient and every oncologist or every physician can consider in the planet.
That company you were talking about was Innutra. Is that innutra.com?
L-Nutra.
L-Nutra. How do you spell it? So it's L like L hyphen Nutra?
L like longevity. L-Longevity. Nutra. Yeah.
Okay. And is that available? I mean, do you need a prescription for it for people? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, no, you don't need a prescription if you're healthy. But if you have a disease, like for example,
Yeah.
diabetes, cancer, then you need the oncologist,
Yeah.
the endocrinologist, etc., to say yes, I agree, and or no, I don't. And so then there is a version for everyone. I don't like to talk about
Sure.
products because
No, that's fine.
but there's a product for everybody, and then there is. I know that they're launching the diabetes program now with endocrinologists all over the world, and so very, very soon, if not already now, I think in the United States, soon around the world, you're going to be able to talk to your endocrinologist and say, I want to get on the fasting mimicking diet for diabetes program, and they can get you on it.
So my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the in terms of macronutrients, this kind of diet is low in carbs, low in protein, sort of higher in good fats. Is that right?
It's relatively high in carbs. It's very low in sugars. It's high in fats. It's very low in protein. It's plant-based. It's 100% plant-based. So there's a lot of tricks that we use to allow people to eat. But also, I designed it to make sure that people wouldn't get to a 7 millimolar ketogenesis mode. So I didn't want like an extreme yo-yo, no ketones, very high ketones. I was
Yeah.
afraid that eventually people get hurt by that. And yeah, I know a lot of people disagree with me, but I've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
And I learned also to think about what could go wrong, even though I've never seen it go wrong.
Yeah.
So that's the way I like to think. And so for that reason, I designed it with a relatively low calorie. So it's about 1,100 calories on day one, goes down to about 800, 750, 800 on day 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's low calorie, plant-based. So a lot of the amino acid composition is pushing the fasting response effect that we want. But then the carbohydrate, even though it's very low calorie, it's relatively high, about 45% of the composition of the calorie contained. So it's fairly high, and that's high for a reason. And that's both compliance and safety. Yeah. A lot of people went against me on that because like, oh, this is, the starches and all of this are gonna block the, and I don't think so. And the clinical trials are proving us right over and over and over. A1C reduction, independently, by the way, of weight loss, right? So there's no correlation with weight loss. So it's unlocking insulin resistance, promoting A1C drop and fat reduction, but the effects on insulin sensitization are independent of the weight loss.
How many calories per day is that?
Yeah, so 1,100 day 1, about 800 day 2, 3, 4, 5.
Got it. One of the things I find very interesting in terms of, I guess, different perspectives and from physicians and from researchers is, I guess, the role of protein. A lot of MDs in the longevity space are actually pushing for a lot of protein, maybe up to a gram per pound, because of the concern for development of sarcopenia, middle age, and beyond. Where I'm curious on your stance on this, and especially and maybe it's completely independent from the intervention that is low protein, but what is your take on higher levels of protein that are sort of, I think, are very common in I guess the biohacker world, especially right now? Do you think they're harmful?
Yes. It's pretty clear they're harmful, and not just. I mean, if you look at all pillars, right? So if you look at clinical data, if you eat a lot of protein, your IGF-1 will go very high, and so not a good thing. If you look at epidemiological, our own paper 10 years ago, we showed that people that had a very low protein diet, at least until age 65, they were doing much better for cancer and overall mortality risk than people with over 20% of the calories coming from proteins. Now it was different in the 70 and 80-year-olds, right? So in the 70 and 80-year-olds, addressing this protein deficiency and sarcopenia, etc., those reporting very low protein intake did not do well at all. They did worse than those having moderate to high protein intake, right? So there is some truth to the fact that some people need a lot more or more protein, not a lot more protein, because between moderate and high intake, there was no difference. So then our recommendation has been low but sufficient, all the way to 70, and then moderate but sufficient after that, together with enough for the training, muscle training and exercise to maintain a normal lean body mass and function.
How do you define that? How do you define low to sufficient or medium?
Well, it's tricky. It's tricky because, so for example, if you have, let's say what you mentioned earlier, 1 gram a day per pound, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the 1 gram a day per pound is from legumes, you may be eating less protein than somebody having 0.2 0.2 grams a day or 0.3 per pound if you were eating, let's say, nut proteins, right? So
Right.
between the nuts and the legumes, you can have a huge difference between the soy protein and the legumes. And same thing in fish, and so it's really about amino acid profile, and so we're going to several papers in the next 6-12 months on this. But I think it's in general, let's say if you're vegan, you want to keep about 0.8, 0.37 grams per pound, 0.37 gram per pound if you're vegan, as long as they nuts and legumes in a balanced way, right? Now, if you're mostly animal based, then 0.37 is good. Is good. So yeah, a lot lower, right? Now we're talking about almost a third of what people are saying. And now, if you're somebody that is a bodybuilder or wants to have a lot more muscle, then we always say just go down as far as most people that do that, they know how much muscle they have and how much muscle they want, and so just keep going down until you start seeing the loss of lean body mass, and you'll be surprised, right? Most people will be surprised. There's studies show that 30 grams after 30 grams of protein per workout session, you're not going to get any effects. And so then it may very well be, it looks like a lot of these proteins are just going to do damage, and not so much, and not good at all, right? So so not a good idea to go into that range. I think it's a way to try to solve a complex problem, throwing something at it that may do something about it, right? So I always use insulin as an example, right? So if you go back to the 1960s and you injected people with insulin, you could say, wow, this is a miracle drug, right? And now think about, as a physician, think about what the consequence of injecting yourself with insulin for 20 years. Not a miracle drug, right? All of a sudden, it could be doing damage in the fact that it make you insulin resistant, but also do cause other problems, maybe contribute to cancer, and so we need to bring in the sophistication and the science, and the multi-pillar science, not just one pillar. And unfortunately, a lot of people that preach high protein diets, maybe one pillar may focus on, let's say, one pillar or maybe half a pillar, because even the epidemiology is very questionable. Whether, I mean, even the Harvard studies will suggest that you can have high protein, but it's going to be negative for you unless it is plant-based, right? It's pretty clear over and over. So both we and they and the Giovannucci, Francu, etc., support if it's going to be high protein, it should be mostly plant-based. I'll go further in saying even plant-based, if it's high amino acids, you have to have limited level of proteins and not too high.
Yeah, fascinating. Tell me what you think about some of the fasting mimetic drugs and supplements. When we talk about, say, spermidine, resveratrol, I guess to a lesser degree, maybe not metformin, that's more of a diabetes control. But I'm curious on your take on those particular supplements and whether you think there's any value based on what you're seeing in research.
I think that I like spermidine, and I like what Frank Madeo has done, and so I think there's a lot of promise. Of course, you have a fasting mimicking diet. You have to run lots of trials, and some trials make them long term. Let's say now we have trials that are a year long, and now we're doing trials on 500 people. So at some point you have to do the trials that are equivalent to those that are done in drug approval by the FDA. And so I think spermidine very promising. and in need to see a lot more trials and do what we do, make it available to universities and clinics, and then see what happens.
Would you see those kinds of drugs more as a daily thing, or would you look at them more like the interventions, like fasting mimetic diets?
You have to think about the good, and you have to think about the bad, right? So if you're taking a drug every day for 20 years, what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And nobody knows, and that's why I really like the fasting mimicking diet. I say 3 times a year, because it's hard to argue that if you take 15 days a year and you have a vegan diet for 15 days with relatively high calorie, that's going to hurt you. I mean, everything is possible, but it's just so extremely unlikely. Now, if you take anything every day, and I just mentioned insulin, uh, what will happen if somebody took insulin every day? Well, let's say there was a oral insulin,
Right.
right, that you could take as a pill. What will happen if somebody took it every day, right?
Right.
Well, look good for a while, and same argument that I just made a second ago. Eventually, so I don't know for these supplements, and that's why we need to see the data, and we need to see also epidemiological data, the 5 pillars. The consumption of spermidine. That's why I like spermidine, because I think Frank has done some work looking at people that have high consumption of food, high spermidine food,
Mm-hmm.
and they seem to do pretty well. So yeah, that's the kind of, I think, data that you want to put together and say, okay, this group of people, they had so much spermidine in their food for 100 years, and they did very well. So seems to be relatively safe. And now I will also say it'd be nice to see it in a form that is representative of that food, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like we do in the fast mimicking diet. I mean, I could have gone out and made a fast mimicking diet out of lard and animal fats, but what I did was instead go and learn from Okinawa, from southern Italy, from the longevity zones of the world, and say, why don't I make it out of the best, healthiest food that I can
Yeah.
imagine? So use macronutrients, but then make it from super healthy food, and that was a very good idea. So I think for these supplements, the 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 argument would be the same. Make it so close to what the people have been consuming that it's hard to argue, oh, this is going to hurt you. Say, well, if
Yeah.
if a million people that have a very high longevity have been consuming high doses of this for so many years, it's unlikely that's going to hurt people taking it every day.
I want to go back. We talked a little bit before, early on. We had alluded to, the different types of time restricted feeding, that kind of thing. And then you had mentioned that you preferred 11 to 12 hours rather than the 16 hours. I'm curious. There was this data, American Heart Association data, which it's retrospective. It was sort of suspect the way they gathered the data, but what they did show was that these 8-hour feeding windows apparently over a long period of time increased the risk of cardiovascular death, and that number was actually pretty significant, almost doubled the risk of cardiovascular death. Now, granted, again, this was not a published study. This was the American Heart Association sort of it was a poster, and the way that the data was gathered was tricky. But what do you make of that? And is this kind of an example of what you're talking about, where you know that you're doing something that maybe have an immediate or short-term benefit, but in the long term may not have the benefit that you thought it did?
Yes. So actually, there are meta-analyses on the breakfast skippers, right? I mean, there's how many studies. It's overwhelming, right? In every study, we had our own, in Chinese group scooped us a few years ago, showing people that skip breakfast have increased cardiovascular disease, increased overall mortality. And so this study is just the number 30, right? I'm just surprised that people are starting to talk about this only now. Now,
Okay.
of course, it used to be about breakfast keepers. And this study now, for the first time, I think made it about the 8 hours, independent of breast keeping. At least that's my understanding of it. As you
Yeah, they
mentioned,
did.
we haven't seen the data. We'll see it, but I think that the opinion of a lot of people and the wishful thinking is being, oh yes, and a lot of my colleagues, oh yes, because the people that skip breakfast have bad habits and have this, have that.
That's right.
I always thought, I just don't see it. I just don't see it. I'm afraid instead that it's we see with gallstone formation and cholesterol density in the gallbladder, which is, if you look at women that do 16 hours of fasting, it just goes very high. And then as you continue fasting, it comes back down, right? But what if you just did 16 hours and then that's it? Well, guess what? The gallbladder operation double, right?
Is that right?
So is it possible the same is true for the heart, for circulation? Yeah, so I don't know, nobody knows, but certainly the epidemiology is one of my strong pillars. I really, really, people should be very respectful of epidemiology and not think of it as, oh, it's a joke. You can get whatever you want out of it. Sure, but this is only one of the pillars, but it's a very important pillar. And so don't underestimate what it's telling you.
So, I guess as a follow up to that, you would advocate for, I mean, for yourself, you're not doing the 16 hours, but you are using sort of more of an 11 or 12 hour window just based on circadian rhythms. Is that right?
That I always say, I've looked very hard and I've never in my life found a negative study on 12 hours of fasting and 12 hours of eating. And, the discussion with Sachin Panda, I think that our compromise is 13 hours of fasting, 11 hours of feeding. So I basically went all the way, came all the way down and say, okay, are we in is this something that we could agree with to, right? And I think it is, right? So 13 hours gets a lot of benefits. In his trials are showing that people that go from 15 hours of feeding to 11 hours of feeding get a lot of benefits. So there is no doubt about the sleep benefit, the metabolic benefit, but so far we haven't seen any ever study of any kind showing, oh, this could happen to you. I mean, I haven't seen it. If somebody's seen it, please send it to me because I would love to read it.
So I think, yeah, this is fascinating stuff. So 13 hours of fasting, and then do you have a sense, does it matter? I mean, obviously, instinctually, you're not going to want to, eat until, the middle, right before bed. But in those 13 hours, is there preferred time that you not eat?
Yeah, I have lots of foundation clinics in Italy and the United States, and we like to. At least my training to the nutritionists and the dietitians, etc., is being don't give to people too many rules, right? They're not gonna do it for very long. So start by asking questions. That's the way we do it. Like, hey, what can you do, right? And you go. So yeah, I'd rather have a person do it if they like it a certain way. They do it that way, and they do 12 hours versus 13. Or something in that range, and they just pick the time, right? Pick whatever it makes is best for them, right? So if somebody wants to, one of the rules is stay away from bed about 3 hours, right? That's the only thing.
Yeah.
Don't eat closer than 3 hours away from your sleep time. But other than that, if you want to do 7 p.m., 7 a.m., 6 p.m., 6 a.m., those are all options. I would say because of metabolic jet lag, it's probably best to stick with it, right? If you do, try to, again, don't obsess over it, because if people say, oh, I forgot, and now what's going to happen to me? Believe it or not, I have people that think like that. So it's okay. If you vary it a little bit, it's okay. But I think in general, it's good to keep it the same. Again, the brain, your sleeping pattern, everything likes that regular intervals.
I'm just looking at the 12-hour thing and thinking to myself, for me, I'm never hungry in the morning anyway. and I usually don't eat till lunch. So automatically, basically, I'm looking at, I mean, on autopilot, I'm almost at an 8-hour window. So for somebody who's doing that, would it be better to say, okay, well, when you wake up, maybe you're not hungry, but if you want to do an 8 to 8 window, you should maybe at least have something small, or, do you want to, in other words, do you want to, even if your normal thing is not to eat in windows that are that expanded, should you try to push yourself to expand that window? In other words, should somebody like me who's not used to eating until noon and finishes by 8, would you, based on what would you say, well, maybe 10 o'clock or something, or 9 o'clock, you should at least try to have something small just to get your body going?
I think if you look at the clinical, this has actually been tested clinically, right? So eventually, have fat people starting the same food, starting at 8 a.m. or 12.
Yeah.
And several studies now shown, if you start at 12 instead of 8, you increase your hunger and you reduce your energy expenditure, right? So so for all these reasons, both clinical, epidemiological, I think it's good to just have breakfast. If you're gonna skip something, skip lunch. That's what I do Monday through Friday. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I think that's the least risky. It's very effective. But I think some people may say, I'm not gonna change, and so I'm worried that, again, this 91% increase in cardiovascular disease or events, I forgot, is real, right? And it has to do with triglyceride deposition in the heart, and or something like that, right? I mean, it's complete speculation.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid, right? I'm afraid that's what it is, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, having seen the data for the gallbladder, you can see how it could very well be a reality for lots of systems.
Yeah.
And so I would say have breakfast, skip lunch.
That's fascinating. Okay. Well, this has been really helpful, Valter. This is great, and certainly for my audience, and also for me, because I think you've changed sort of the framework for me on ways of looking at this. Your book, The Longevity Diet, Slow Aging, Fight Disease, Optimize Weight. Presumably, we can get that anywhere. Also, want to just once again remind people of where they can get their hands on that fasting mimetic diet, which may be of interest to people, which is l-nutra.com. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and would love to have you on again sometime.
Thank you. Be
right back. Just a little wrap up here of our discussion with Valter Longo. First of all, I got to tell you, I've just really, really found that to be a very interesting interview. And, it's in the things particularly that I wanted to talk about and emphasize is, first of all, I think there are some real controversies in longevity medicine right now. And one of them is with regard to time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting, whatever you want to call it. And I got to tell you, the American Heart Association study came out, and I was intermittent fasting. I was on 6 or 7 hour windows. And then that study came out, and then everybody, in the field who was supporting intermittent fasting. So it was a terrible study. I wouldn't take it I wouldn't take it seriously at all, even though, sure, it was poorly designed, but it did show literally a doubling of the risk of cardiovascular death with an 8 hour or less window of eating. So for me, I still took that very seriously. And then you put that together with some of the information that we got here from Valter Longo, and I can't say that I would consider time-restricted feeding to be a good long-term activity. And when I say that, I'm talking about these windows that are, typically shorter than 10 hours, right? I think, as Dr. Longo mentioned, I think he's really looking at this not really as he's looking at time-restricted feeding more as connecting with our circadian rhythms. In other words, giving our bodies a time to sort of get used to when food comes in and when it doesn't, so that they can kind of run the appropriate programs, right? You have a anabolic or building program, and then you have a catabolic or breakdown program. And so to me, what I think I'm starting to think about this very differently. I think there was also another study that recently that showed that that intermittent fasting didn't necessarily perform that much better than not fasting if you just controlled for calories when it came to insulin resistance. And that of course is also interesting, because what really could be is that when you do restrict your food to 8 hours or less, like I was doing, for example, you're going to eat less, right? So the question is it about eating less? Is it having less calories that's helping with that insulin resistance? Or is it, the hours that are involved? So the point I'm trying to make is not to make a decision for you one way or another, but I do think it's very dangerous to listen to one side or the other and get religious about any one or the other positions, because these things I think they're dynamic. And if you look back at all of the major changes in thinking, even over the last few decades in medicine, whether that comes to, the role of carbohydrates in our diets, for example, I would still maintain that, the food pyramid is wrong, and that the Women's Health Initiative that suggested that, women should, or at least was misinterpreted as women not really, that women should not be on a hormone replacement. These things were wrong, and we figured that out, right? And so things constantly change, and what's, I think, a dangerous situation in these days is that when it comes to diet, when it comes to these types of things, rather than looking at data, there again is these diets become religion. And that's a problem, because when something becomes religion, it's dogmatic, and you're not really looking at it with open eyes. So that's some comments I have on this topic. Again, fascinating interview, and I think certainly I haven't read Dr. Longo's book, and I'm going to grab a copy of it, and I'm also going to try this 5-day fasting mimetic diet. I'm gonna try it maybe every 3 months or something like that, and try to order it myself. So anyway, check it out for yourself if you're interested. Thanks for tuning in. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am in fact a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.